Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator for Gibson's, and we are very pleased to have here this evening Erin Bowman, one of our very favorite local authors. She has written a new book, The Girl and the Witch's Garden. She is joined in conversation tonight by Julie Dao, who has written several books herself, mostly YA. Her books include, I've gone too far. Her books include Song of the Crimson Flower, Forest of a Thousand Lanterns, Kingdom of the Blazing Phoenix. Erin has written several series. She has a dystopian series, Taken, Frozen, and Forged. She has a Western duology, Vengeance Road and Retribution Rails, and then a Edgar-nominated series, Contagion and Immunity. The Girl and the Witch's Garden is her first middle grade novel, and Gibson's Bookstore events program is sustained by book sales. So if you would like a copy of The Girl and the Witch's Garden, we do have them available for order from the store. We do ship internationally. We might have to get a shipping quote for that. I'm going to toss a link to that in the chat, and while I do that, Julie, Erin, take it away. Well, thank you for joining us here this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Congratulations, Erin. Today is your book birthday for The Girl and the Witch's Garden. Do you want to give us a quick little snippet about what it's about?
Sure, yeah. So The Girl and the Witch's Garden, I feel like I should hold it up too now.
Okay, we'll both hold it up.
So it's my first middle grade novel. It follows a 12-year-old girl named Piper Peavy, who is sent to live with her estranged mother and grandmother at Mallory Estate for the summer while her father is in the hospital battling cancer. And when she arrives at the house, she realizes that her mother has been fostering some children, and she's rightfully furious about this because she hasn't seen this woman since she was about 4 years old. But the more she hangs out with the children, she realizes things are not quite as they seem. The garden out back, which appears dead, can actually be alive if you access it through the right doorway. And the kids are trying to find that doorway. And so Piper sort of joins them in that quest because she learns that inside the garden is a powerful elixir that may be able to save her father. So her goals sort of end up aligning with the children at the estate. So it's adventure, it's about friendships, family, some themes of grief, but it's also really lighthearted and sweet as well. So it's got a little bit of everything.
It's the perfect combination. Seriously, when I was reading it, I felt so nostalgic for all of the middle grade stories that I grew up with. Like The Secret Garden, I saw shades of Harry Potter, I saw a little bit of Coraline, which is one of my favorite Neil Gaiman books. We were speaking about Neil Gaiman earlier. And I just love that the setting is this spooky old mansion. That's one of my favorite atmospheric settings for any middle grade story. The mansion in the book is owned by the main character's grandmother. What was your inspiration for the mansion?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to say I'm glad it made you nostalgic because it's literally pieces of every single book I loved reading at that age. So pretty much all of my favorite novels from those like middle grade reader years were influences. There's pieces of everything, as you said, in there. The house actually came after the garden. The garden was the first piece of inspiration, and it was actually inspired by a real location. This is the book I say that was the longest in the making because the very first story kernel for this book came to me when I was 13 years old on a family vacation to a place called Brook Green Gardens. It's just outside Myrtle Beach. And they had these beautiful gardens that included, and I'm going to show you the map in the book. It included one section of the garden had these pathways that if you were a bird flying overhead, it looked like a butterfly. That's what the pathways formed. Wow. And that is like the one, this book changed so much. I don't know if this is coming through on the screen, but you can see the pathways make a butterfly. And so it's the one thing that stayed with me. And then, obviously after creating this really elaborate grounds, I was like, well, this needs to be a pretty elaborate house. And so I was inspired by a couple different things. A lot of the older historic houses that are in the Connecticut, like Hartford and Northwest Corner area, which is where the book is set, which is also coincidentally where I grew up. I grew up in Northwestern Connecticut. And just the Biltmore estate down in Asheville, like the house in this book is not as big as that, but I love how that house feels like there are secrets in it. It just has all of these, like an ornate library, all of these rooms that each had their own purpose. And so all of that kind of channeled into building out the estate.
Yeah, it feels like the house had a story that was just waiting to be told, and it just unfolded as you went through the pages. And it reminded me a lot of the cottages. They call it cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, where the wealthy families like the Vanderbilts would
Yes.
summer. And that reminded me a lot of that. It was a very nostalgic New England feel, which I loved. So atmospheric and spooky. In the house, the grandmother has this cat named, what was his name?
Wolf.
Wolf, that's right. I was trying to find the name. It's a white Persian cat, and that cat reminded me so much of Mrs. Norris in Harry Potter, because Mrs. Norris was the caretaker's cat, and she would go around and spy on Harry and all of his friends. Similar to how this Persian cat spies on Piper and all of her friends. Why did you choose a cat to be Mrs. Mallory's pet, and not just any cat, but a white cat, which is contrary to that witch? The typical witch cat is black.
Yeah. So it's funny that you mentioned Mrs. Norris, because when you said, like, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, that is really similar. I didn't even think of that writing it, which is so funny because I grew up on Harry Potter and I love how Mrs. Norris spies and then Filch comes running and everyone gets in trouble, right? The white Persian was specifically just having white over black, just a detour. That was one of the things in the very first chapter when you first meet Piper. There's all this talk about how there's a rumor among the kids that the owner of this estate is a witch. And none of the grownups believe it, right? Because grownups don't see things the way the kids do, but the kids know just because the cat's white doesn't mean she's not a witch. Like, that's how she's tricking you guys. You're not looking hard enough. So part of it, and I don't know if you're like this, Julie, I'd love to hear your opinion. Some things I really work to incorporate and others just kind of pop in. And when I started writing this book, I was like, oh, it's a white Persian. Like, I liked that it was white because it was the opposite of what you expect of a witch. But otherwise,
Right.
That's just the animal that walked into my head. I didn't have to work that hard to pull that character in. Do you have that? Like, it just clicks sometimes, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big plotter. I don't know if you're a plotter. Are you?
I am. Yes, I am.
You outline your books.
Yes.
So you generally know what's going to happen from beginning to end, but the same thing with me. Sometimes spontaneous things pop up. Sometimes characters go away. Sometimes characters come in. So it's probably similar to the white Persian cat who just walked into the pages of your story. I love when that happens because it feels kind of magical, doesn't it? It's a story that you're writing, but you didn't even plan some of these aspects.
Yeah. And like, when you talk about outlining at the beginning, it was always like the witch has a cat. Like, so that's how it started, you know, outlining it. And the cat will show up here and the cat will spy. And here's what the cat will, trigger these plot points. And just at some point when I started building out, I mean, it's a minor character, the cat, but I always, build out your characters.
Sure.
And once I started doing that, I was like, oh, it's a white Persian. And that just stuck, and it felt right from the very beginning. And I love how he's on the cover.
Yes, it's so cute. And he's got such a, look at that expression on his face. I don't know if you can see that well. I love it. Your cover art is so beautiful.
I was very fortunate. Yeah, I love this. It reminds me of Howl's Moving Castle, kind of.
Yes, exactly. It's very Miyazaki. And look at all the butterflies, the hints of the shape of the garden. That's really, really cool. Did you know that Wolf was going to be an important character, or did you just decide?
That was when we talk about plotting. I knew pretty early on. And when I say early on, I mean when I started plotting this book seriously and it actually started to resemble the story that it is now. Because the idea I had when I was 13, like, I started writing this book on that vacation, but it was about like wizards and chosen ones and like this parallel dimension that you accessed through the garden and the end of the world. It was like, what all of us write at 13. It was very, not that there's anything wrong with any of those tropes. I love all of those things. But it was a very different story then. I would say it was about 5 years ago when I truly started thinking, like, being like, I want to figure out what this story is really about. And that's when I put more thought into all of the players, Wolf included. So
I think it's so amazing that you've had this idea since you were 13. That means something. It means something when a story idea just sticks with you for years and years and years. And it's really cool that you finally got to write it and it became your middle grade debut after writing so many young adult novels. How does that feel to enter the middle grade world?
Well, first, is very special that it's my middle grade debut and that it finally amounted to something, because it was an idea that it just lingered. Like, I never forgot that place, those gardens. I would love to tour them again. I haven't been back. And I wish I have a picture of me at it, but it's not physical, it's digital, so I can't show you guys. But I'd love to go back because it just I had what I like to call a muse explosion. Like that's what I call it when some of my stories come slowly. This was one where the idea, I was walking through this garden at that age and it just like, I was like, whoa, there's something here. And like some pieces started to appear. And so then to finally have it coming into the world all of these years later, it's like really nice. I'm glad it kept bugging me. I'm glad it like never went away, that it was always just kind of back there simmering. And some stories take a lot of simmer time. Contagion was that way for me too. It took a very, very, very long time. Not as long as this, but it took a long time to figure out that story. So it's really special and it's really exciting that it's my middle grade debut, because I already said this earlier. It has so many pieces of books I loved at that age too.
Right.
So
right. Totally. It's like a tribute to you being a kid. And I hope you will get to go back to those gardens and take a picture of your book in the garden. That would be really cool.
Right.
After the pandemic's over.
Yeah.
That would be awesome. So gardens are such an interesting place to set this sort of treasure hunt that you made Piper go on. Why did you decide a garden specifically? I know that you were inspired by that garden that you had been to, but why a garden?
Part of it, so you mentioned Secret Garden earlier, which as many classics, rereading it as adult, I was like, whoa, this is a little problematic. But the piece of that book, the whole idea of like a lost and forgotten space being a really special place for the characters and having magical things happen in that very real world setting, I loved that about that book as a kid. And I've also always loved novels that have some sort of like quest or trial built in. And these gardens they're also full of these very interesting statues. And it just felt like the perfect sandbox. Especially because when Piper arrives at this estate, this isn't a spoiler, you find it out in like the first 2 or 3 chapters, the gardens are completely dead. They're like burned and charred and nothing is growing there. So the whole idea of like needing to find a portal to access this thriving, magical, beautiful place, it felt like the right setting, for them to go on that adventure together.
Yeah, there's something about a lost, mysterious garden with all these nooks and crannies and secret corners that really makes the environment pop for these kids, because just imagining being a kid and wandering through this gorgeous, like all the hedges and the bushes and the roses, like just coming out. I think it's a gorgeous atmospheric setting. That kind of segues into my next question. So going back to the plotting versus writing by the seat of your pants style, did you plan for Piper to be experience with gymnastics before you wrote the scene where she enters the garden? She finds the secret doorway. I'm not going to spoil it, but she goes through this doorway and it requires her to do a little bit of gymnastics. So what came first, the doorway or the gymnastics?
So the doorway came first, and like Julie, I won't spoil exactly where it is or how it's accessed, but it does require some aerobatics to get through it. And part of that from the plotting perspective was I need this doorway to be something that someone wouldn't have stumbled upon accidentally yet. Like the kids and the grandmother, Piper's grandma and mother at the estate have been searching for the true entrance to this garden for years and no one has found it. So I needed it to be, they walk every inch of this estate. They've been trying to find the way in. So it couldn't just be a doorway that you could, waltz through. So that might be giving you some hints if you haven't read it yet, that it's not in a super obvious place. No, it doesn't. I know. We all know she's going to get into it. It's fine. So after I figured out where that doorway was going to be, then it was like, ooh, how do I get her to be able to do this easily? And then she's a pretty spunky character and she kind of already was when I was building her out. And I was like, well, she's been like running 5Ks with her aunt to raise money for cancer research to help her dad. I was like, I just got to give her another sport that gives her the means to get through this portal. And that's sort of where gymnastics came in. My daughter was doing gymnastics at the time as well. So that was kind of where my brain went to first. And I was like, this feels right. This feels really natural. That's the best when you kind of like create you walk yourself into a corner. Like I made it so hard to find that entrance. And I was like, ooh, how do I do? But it felt natural and it felt right. So that was nice.
No, I like that that's special because that entrance was meant for Piper to find it. So there's a lot of destiny, a lot of fate intertwined in the story of Piper going on this quest, because if it was a doorway that any kid could find, then the reader would ask, why hasn't this doorway been found already? So it's only when Piper comes to the estate and she starts hunting for this doorway into the garden, that's when it becomes found. So I think it was really, really cool that she was meant to find it. I love that. Going along with that, so what helps her kind of see that doorway is another kid's affinity. So in the book, all of the kids have these special powers called affinities. Some of them can become invisible. Some of them can see things that traces of magic, basically. Some of them can bend time. If you had a choice, what affinity would you have and why?
I have always said that I think bending time would be, and I wouldn't use it to like go back in time, because like Lord knows I don't want to go back to the past. Like that was only good for straight white men, and I don't really want to go in the future and mess anything up. But like to be able to like just get an extra hour each day, like, and so part of me is like, that would be the best, but I bet you would still just be just as busy and just as stressed. So maybe it wouldn't matter, but that's what my inclination is that I would love to be able to, like Hermione with her time turner.
Kind of
right?
like I was just going to say, yep, you just turn the time turner.
Get an extra hour, get a little bit done, a little extra stuff off my to-do list, and that would be wonderful. What would you want, Julie? Exactly. I want to know.
I would want to be invisible. I've given this a lot of thought while I was reading the book. I would definitely want to be invisible and just be able to sneak around and go wherever I want. Maybe even during the pandemic, which is going on right now, like I could walk around silently in empty spaces that you're not allowed in, like Disney World. How cool would it be to walk around Disney World? Just invisible.
So like invisible would be awesome for all those reasons. My fear is I would stumble upon like hearing something or seeing something that I don't want to. Like,
yeah. Like if someone's talking, saying bad things about you.
I'm a delicate flower. I can't handle that.
That's true. Well, avoid people.
Yeah, exactly. Just
Social
go to Disney.
Distance.
Go to Disney World when it's empty. That would be perfect.
That's right. Yeah, I love all the affinities you described in the book. I think seeing traces of magic would be pretty cool too. Like one of the kids has an item that helps him see wherever magic has been. I think that would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Seek out ordinary spaces. In the garden. So we were talking about how magical gardens can be for kids. In the garden, they go on this quest. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, but they have to face different trials in order to get what they want. And one of the trials is a moment where Piper and one of her friends has to face a fear, their worst fear. What would be some of your worst fears to face if you were going on a garden quest?
It's a good question. And I love that idea of it's facing your fears. It's done in a lot of different books. That was one of my favorite scenes in Divergent too, like when they have to, and so some of my fears are silly and irrational, and some are very real. The irrational one, anyone who knows me, I've spoken about this before on some other panels. I'm terrified of clowns, like absolutely terrified. And I wrote that in one of the characters has a fear of clowns. They're just creepy and they're weird. And they have like a painted smile on, and
I think it's a perfectly rational fear, honestly.
They're so creepy. I like cannot, if they end up in a movie, like I can't, I can't do it. I'm stuttering now because it's so irrational. Let's not talk about them anymore. So I would have a fear of clowns. We are living the other fear, which is what triggered Contagion, was I am, very, very afraid of outbreaks, because we can't control them. We can't fight them. They're invisible. And like, thank goodness for the most part that this virus doesn't seem to affect children that badly, because that would be my third fear, is something bad happening to my kids.
Happen to your kids.
And so that's like the newer one since becoming a mother.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Germs are one of my biggest fears too. So I wonder what my trial in this garden would be. Just like use tissues.
I don't know how I would beat these things. And like, I don't consider myself a germaphobe. Like I wash my hands and I stay clean and everything, but it's like, I think it's the idea that like when outbreaks happen, like what we're living through now, no one has any immunity yet. So they just spread like wildfire and they get out of control so quickly. And that's the part that's always scary. What would your fears be, Julian?
Germs,
besides
and heights. I don't like heights at all, which is weird because I don't mind flying in planes and looking out of the window. Like, I don't know why, it doesn't feel real, but if I'm standing on a very high floor of a building and looking down from there, then I'm really scared. My heart starts beating. I get vertigo a little bit. I don't like it. I think my trial would be standing on the edge of something high, like a cliff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the difference is you can fall off that, whereas in the plane,
That's true.
Enclosing you, and you're
you're
sitting.
safe. That's right. You've got a seatbelt on.
Yeah, like to an extent. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a rational fear as well.
Yeah.
That's totally okay.
I think we would do okay in that garden, Erin. I think we would make it there.
Because I mean, if we fail those, we're not finding any powerful elixir. We're just
That's
stuck.
right.
We've
That's
dead-ended.
right. So we got to work on that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in middle grade, I've noticed that there are a lot of missing or dead parents. That seems to be a trope that follows many characters in middle grade stories, because it gives the characters freedom to do whatever they want without someone worrying about them, asking, what time are you going to be home? You gave Piper in this story, so she reconnects with her mother, who I don't think it's a spoiler to say, but she never really wanted Piper. And they don't really have a great relationship. And when she comes there, you find out that Piper's mom is so mean and sort of brusque and really abrupt. Is this a different play on the parent trope that you wanted to take? And did you want to do something different with the portrayal of parents?
I mean, yes and no. Part of it is we do see so many missing parents. And we see it in YA too. And it's for exactly the reason you said. Like, we need the kids to be able to go off and have an adventure without an adult tracking them down and being like, get home.
Right.
But a big part, so when we talk about books from our childhood that we loved, I loved Roald Dahl books. And like, he has the trope of like the mean, terrible parent or adult figure, like this very negative force, sometimes abusive or emotionally abusive or manipulative. And so I wanted to, and I always sound so awful to say, but I loved that. I don't know. I mean, Harry deals with that too, with his aunt and uncle, right? Something about that just feels so middle grade to me. And it also just worked with the story. It makes Piper very blind to certain things once she arrives at the estate, and very kind of like a narrowed focus. Like, the other kids are saying, hey, your mom's actually not that bad. And Piper's like, no, she's awful. And like, rightfully so, because she has all of this baggage, but she doesn't see her mother fully and clearly, which who would? She's 12 years old, right? Like, these are complex things. But so it's kind of all of that combined, like playing with tropes I liked. And also I needed Piper to sort of not see certain things and also be like, you know, pushing against her mother, wanting to do things her own way. And so it kind of all came together.
Yeah, it's a tough relationship to explore for sure, especially when you're 12 years old. That's when I feel most kids are discovering that their parents are just people, and their parents make mistakes, and their parents aren't perfect. Because when you're little, you look up to your mom and dad. They know everything. They have all the answers. But when you're 12, it's starting to come out like, oh, okay, these people aren't perfect. They aren't gods. They don't know everything. So I think it was really cool that you gave Piper's mom such an interesting twist on the parental trope.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a complicated, because it's kind of heartbreaking in some places. I won't spoil anything, but if you read it, you'll see it's they have a not great relationship, to put it lightly.
And I think it's important to showcase all kinds of relationships in middle grade. Like, not everyone has a perfect mom-daughter, father-son, an opposite relationship. So actually, difficult parents are something that comes up in my writing a lot. Is there a trope in all of your books that you've noticed that you keep inserting without meaning to?
I don't know if this isn't really a trope, but there's just elements that end up in all of my books. There's almost always a big twist, almost always. I love having a big twist in like the last third. So that just comes down to plotting, and it's in almost all of my books.
Right.
I also really like morally gray characters, and I would say Piper is still that way too. She kind of lies or withholds information and kind of manipulates her friends a little bit. And I think you understand why she's doing it, but like, she's definitely not wearing like a shiny badge. You know what I mean? But that's big in a lot of my stories. And it's taken to a bigger extreme in my YA novels, because they are often just bigger and more intense in scope, like pandemics and like Western revenge novels. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a different world. But I have a morally gray character in almost all of my books. And the other one, I don't know, is this considered a trope? Setting as a character? Is that like, that's like one of the, right? That's like a trope. Yeah. That is something I love. And you'll see that, like, that's true in my Westerns. It's true in Contagion, and like the garden in this one too. Like, I love settings that almost feel like a character or create their own obstacles for the characters. And the garden is that way in this as well. So I feel like those are the Bowman elements.
Nice.
If you like any of those things, try my books.
Yeah, I like what you said about the difficult characters. Did it take you a long time to flesh Piper out? How much work did you put into her before you wrote the first draft, or did you discover her as you went along?
I mean, I always discover, I don't know, you'll have to tell me if you're the same way, but I always discover a lot about my characters in the process of writing the first draft. Like, even if I think I have them figured out, you usually figure out more over the course of writing the novels. So, for me, it's always the character arc. Like, I know where I want it to start and where I want it to end, but it's never nailed in that first draft. And figuring out what is necessary to nail that arc is usually what I discover over the course of revisions. So I don't want to talk too much about that because it will give away too much of the book, but that's what happened with Piper. And then I would say it was more the other kids that I had to do more work with, which is always true for me. My secondary characters are never, no one's fully fleshed out, but they always need a little more work, you know, because they're secondary and you spend a little less time in their heads. And yeah. What about you? Do you do the same sort of, I feel like it's like a layering act, right? Like each revision you layer.
It's like painting a canvas, you know, you have to layer the ground level. I always describe writing the first draft as teaching yourself what this world is like. It's you walking into the pages of your book to come and looking around, you know, introducing yourself to the characters, acclimating to the environment, learning what all the pieces are. And then as you do each subsequent draft, as you revise, like more shading comes into play. You understand the characters' motivations better. You understand the nooks and crannies and corners of your world in a way that you didn't see that first time around. So I think that writing is very much a layering act, as you said. That was a great word. It's never fully formed right away. No writer writes a perfect draft. And I think that
I wish we could.
I wish we could. Wouldn't that be nice? You just sit down, you pound it out, and bam, there's a book ready to be published. But that's not the way it works. And I feel that so many new writers are really hard on themselves because they're comparing their first or second or third drafts to a book that's been polished and, you know, ship shape condition. And it's just gone through many rounds of renditions and revisions. So
I have a hard time even, like, the next time I write something new, like when you come off of finishing a book, even like, just for me, you know, and you're pretty seasoned too, Julie, I still, when you go from, like, I don't know, the line edits or copy edits or past page stages of a book and jump back into a first draft, it is jarring. And you're like, oh my gosh, I am terrible. What am I doing? It's like very jarring every time for me still.
Right.
So, yeah.
Here's another fear of mine to add to our garden quest is starting a new book, because I'm always terrified that I've forgotten how to do it.
Yeah. Well, I've always said you have to learn how to write each book. Like each book, you have to learn how to write it. Like,
Yep. It's a whole new process. It's a whole new, you know, depending on genre, depending on what age category, because this is your first middle grade, I'm sure it was kind of difficult to jump into that different age category when you've been writing teenagers for so long. So every book is a new challenge.
It's true.
I have one more question for you, and it's kind of a hard-hitting, kind of a heavy one, because your book deals with grief in the midst of all of this fun adventuring and learning about magic and affinities. Piper is dealing with the very real problem of her dad, who is very, very sick. He's got cancer. And grief in middle grade fiction is something I don't come across very often. So what made you decide to tackle this really important topic?
I don't know what this says about me as a middle grade reader, but two of my favorite books from my middle grade reading years were Bridge to Terabithia and Tuck Everlasting. and both of these novels, and this is where I feel like I said, this book has a lot of different pieces. Like, it's very magical and adventurous and fun, and there's, you know, banter and friendships and all of this wonderful stuff. But what I loved about those two titles I just mentioned was they deal with that grief and that loss of a loved one and how difficult that is. And I also think that at this age range, like the middle grade age range, people obviously lose loved ones at younger ages than that. But I feel like that sort of bubble is where a lot of kids do experience that for a first time. Like maybe it's a grandparent, maybe it's an aunt and uncle, maybe it is a parent. And I think exploring things through fiction is like really, really it's safe and it's comforting and it's helpful.
Yes.
And so like, I never set out to teach a lesson with my books. Like whatever people take away from the book is the right lesson. But that was something in the back of my head, because when I read those novels I mentioned, as a child, I had lost a couple people, like a couple grandparents and an uncle, like all in a very short span of time.
Yeah.
And I saw pieces of myself in those stories and how it like really eats you up. So
Totally.
yeah, so that kind of all, and pairing it with magic. That's what I loved about Tuck Everlasting. Like there's like this magical undercurrent to it. And it's a adventure and a fantasy, but it deals with some big topics. So
Right. Yeah, I think that's why books are so special. They're windows. They're windows for us to deal with very real problems in our lives, but not having to look at them directly because you're in a fantasy world, or you're with Piper at her grandmother's estate. You know, you're dealing with all of these topics and themes that kids go through that are very real, but you're removed a little bit. It's a little bit of a distant experience. So I am very grateful that you wrote a book that deals with something so important that kids are going through or may go through soon. So it prepares them a little bit.
Thanks.
Speaking of books are special, remember these books are available for sale, right, Elizabeth?
That was, yep, I'm going to hit the link I had prepped to go in the chat box. This book and Erin's other books and Julie's books are available for purchase at Gibson's Bookstore. Our events program is sustained by book sales. Any book of Erin's that you purchase, she is close enough that we can do a socially distant, safe signing of the books in our bookstore. So you will get an actual signed book, actual pen on paper, not just a book plate, but she will actually signs them. So, and she can personalize them too. So I tossed the link right into our chat box here. And now is the time we're opening up for questions. So if you have questions in our audience, please do click around, find the chat bar, find the Q&A. I do want to mention on your last comment there about experiencing books through tough subjects through books. It's kind of like they're practicing by proxy for situations that they might face in their life. So in order, if they can go through a tough situation before they experience it, they have a template, they understand what's going to happen. Sometimes if it's one where they have to be braver or stronger, they've seen someone else do it rather than them experiencing it for the very first times themselves. And those difficult situations can be a little bit easier for young people if they've seen a character go through it themselves, and they certainly feel less alone. So I'm a big fan of that, especially for in the middle grade and the YA genres, because those are when people are going through a lot of firsts in their lives, and it's really tough. Let's look at some of our audience questions here. Bruna says, what was the main challenge of writing a middle grade novel? And SL Rinaldi wants to say, did you consciously make the decision to write in middle grade genre? And why did you make that decision?
So for me, this just felt so middle grade with the quest in the garden. And also I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, just in that past question of like experiencing firsts that are really difficult, like losing a loved one. It all felt right for the middle grade genre. And I quote this person I cannot recall who said it. I quote this person all the time. I was on a panel with someone and they said the difference between middle grade and YA, I so wish I could remember who said this because it's brilliant. They said YA, right, is about a character figuring out who they want to be and going out in the world and being that person and making change. You know, like it's like true. It's like the end of a character arc, right? Like this is who I'm going to be, and you go out in the world and be it. And middle grade, they said, is about going off and having an adventure and then coming home, which I thought was such a wonderful way to sum up the differences. You know, you learn something about yourself. You maybe learn that the adults, like Julie was saying earlier, aren't perfect. They're just humans. And, you know, you see some injustices, but you still come home. And so I knew that that was what Piper's journey was going to be too. Like she wasn't 17, 18, having this adventure in a garden and then going off to be who she needed to be. She was experiencing some things for the first time. And then she was returning home. She was still going to rely on some adults in her life and, you know, come out changed. But so for me, it just felt so perfectly middle grade. And in terms of the challenges of writing it, I didn't really think there were any challenges that didn't exist writing a YA novel. Writing books is hard, period, at least for me. This is only my first middle grade, and I've written 7 young adult novels. So maybe ask me in a few more middle grade novels, but the same challenge, the thing that I always struggle with the most is nailing my character arcs. So that was how I felt with this too. It was the same struggle. There's other things I struggle with too, but that's usually the hardest one for me from start to finish and through all the revisions. And that remained true, unfortunately, in middle grade.
So this is middle grade, as you just mentioned. You have written mostly YA before. Did you have any hesitation about moving to a middle grade age range? Did you worry it would muddle, between your niche, between what you've written before? And also, Jenny wants to know, can you tell us a little bit about the YA you've written, because she's new to your works? Tell her about them.
Yeah. I didn't worry too much about jumping into a new space. I have jumped, this kind of answers the other question about my YAs. I have jumped genres so many times already. Like my YAs, I have like a dystopia novel was my debut trilogy. Then I wrote 2 historical fiction, like Wild West revenge stories. Then I wrote like true sci-fi, like out in deep space, sci-fi horror. Then I wrote this middle grade novel that's like a fantastical adventure portal fantasy, right? So like, I have been jumping around since the beginning. Not every author does that. It's worked okay for me so far. I kind of have different publishers for my different types of books. So like my middle grade is with Simon and Schuster. My sci-fi, so like my dystopia and my sci-fi horrors were with Harper. And then my historicals and my Westerns have been with HMH. So I feel like publishers are the ones who often want to put us in boxes. It just makes it easier for them to market us and to sell us. So I have been fortunate that I've been able to find like different homes for all of those books, but I have just jumped around and written what I have wanted to write. And as Julie had asked earlier, I kind of have pieces that make my books, like there is overlap. Like if you like some of the things in my middle grade, you'll like, hopefully, most of my YAs. So you have to read your book so many times by the time it's published that I just have to write what I love and what I'm into, or I would be miserable. I don't know. Julie, do you feel the same way kind of? Like
I do.
Yeah.
I have to be in love with the story first.
Yeah.
I always say anytime I write a story, I have to want to be a reader for that story before I write the story.
Yeah. Yeah. So I hope that answers that question. It was kind of a roundabout, but yeah.
Was anyone in particular the inspiration for Piper?
No, not really. I feel like she has, and this is often true for every character I write, she has pieces of people I know and pieces of me in her as well, but I've never actually based any of my characters like solely off of one person. It's just pieces of people. And I think Piper struggles with, I never had a parent dealing with cancer as a child. I did not have to deal with that. I had an aunt who went through that. But Piper's difficulties in school, kind of with like sometimes feeling invisible among her peers. Like she also, this isn't a spoiler, in the first chapter you learn she's kind of had like a big falling out with her best friend. That person is no longer her best friend. And that's like very isolating and traumatic. Like we all go through friendship losses over the course of our lives. Like I'm still going through some in adulthood. Like they're not fun to go through. But one of my first ones happened in those years. We talk about middle grade years being first. I was probably like 12 or 13. So like those experiences get channeled into her, but she's not inspired by any one person.
Well, there's a comment here from Natasha who says she is a middle school librarian, and she compliments you on your description of Piper's relationship and view of her mother is basically a middle schooler personified. So,
excellent. Good. Thank you.
And then let's see, we do have a question. Did you always want to be a writer? How do you fit your writing into your busy life as a mom, which you're very vocal about on social media? And then also, how long did it take you to edit your first drafts when you started your writing career?
I always loved writing. I think I always had like the dream of being a writer, but I didn't go to school. I minored in writing, but I went to school for web design. That's what I did professionally first. My parents always supported my writing, but they were always very much of the mindset, and I agree with them, of like, go get a job that pays the bills while you pursue your writing. And that is still my advice to writers. Like, I hate to aspiring writers, especially young ones. I'm not trying to poo-poo anyone's dream, because like, by all means, keep pursuing it. But most writers will tell you this is not a career that you are going to make boatloads in. And it's also very unpredictable. Like, you could do well one year and then the next year make almost nothing. So sometimes I wish I hadn't left web design completely. So I did end up, like, I always wanted to write, but it wasn't like, I'm going to be a published author. That didn't really come until I was like in my mid-20s, and was like, ooh, I actually want to really try to get a book published. What was the next part? I've already forgotten. How long did the drafts take? Is that what it was? Okay. It really depends. If I can actively focus just on the draft and I'm not like jumping around between other deadlines, I can usually write a first draft, like first, not great or polished, in about like 4 to 6 months. That's usually what I average. Some writers are faster, some are slower, but then the course of like revision and editing, it's usually after that first draft, another like 1.5 to 2 years before the book enters the world. And in terms of fitting it in while with children, I used to hate that question of like, how do you make it work as a mom? Because I felt like dudes never got, how do you fit me, make it work as a father? They don't get asked that question. And so for a while I wouldn't answer it on principle. And then I started realizing that there are aspiring mommy writers out there, or even, maybe dads who are doing the bulk of the childcare because their wife has a full-time job or whatever, who will look at people who they know have kids who are writing, and they're probably like, how do they make it work? How am I doing something wrong? And you're not, because it's just really, really hard. So I've been super transparent about the fact that I used to have a nanny 3 days a week, and now we're in a pandemic. So I used to do the bulk of my writing 3 days a week within a certain time block of about 6 hours on those 3 days. And then on evenings and weekends when I had to, when deadlines demanded it. Now I haven't written very much in a while. It's early mornings, it's evenings. And then I'm trying to still spend time with my family on the weekends. So honestly, it's only if I really need to, then my husband will like take them on a Saturday and I'll work all day Saturday. So it's hard. If you're struggling, you're not doing anything wrong.
SL Rinaldi does want to know, do you plan to write children's books as well? And I presume by that she means
like picture books?
Picture books.
Or maybe youth fiction rather than middle.
Chapter books.
Yeah, like chapter books or early readers. I would love to. I have always said, I don't know if you guys agree, I feel like the shorter or like the younger the audience, the more difficult it gets. Like, obviously it's not a ton of time to revise a chapter book that's only 600 words. Like, you can truly revise that in a day or two, but to boil a story down to so little is super, super challenging. And I have played with some picture book ideas, and some have gone nowhere because it's really hard. But I'd love to write some picture books. I would love to I don't have an idea for one, but I'm reading a lot of early readers right now with my daughter, the early readers and like the chapter books for like, I don't know, like the second grade level. They're really fun. I'd love to do this. I'd love to write adult someday too. For me, it's nothing's off limits. Julie, I want to know if you're the same, but nothing's off limits. It's just, I need the right idea. I need the right, are you the same way, Julie?
I am. Yeah. I just need the character and the plot. And
yeah.
Off I go. It doesn't matter what age category.
Yeah. But without that, so like, that's what I was with my Westerns. I always wanted to write a Western for the longest time. And until I had the right story idea, it was just wish. And then it happened. So never say never to any of those other age groups or audiences.
So the person who asked about editing wants to clarify, how long did the editing process of your first book take when you were still new to the process? Before you had a process?
It honestly was probably faster because you don't know what you don't know when you're starting out. So like, I think I thought that book was a lot better than it was a lot sooner on. I was working a full-time job when I wrote like my very first full-length novel that I wrote, I was in between jobs. The next one that I like, once I wrote Taken, like my first book that got published, that one I wrote in the evenings and the weekends in between a full-time job. I still think the first draft only took about 4 months. And then I revised it probably for like at least half a year, might have been a little longer before I queried. And then I got an agent very quickly. I was lucky. I was writing a dystopia during like the Hunger Games Divergent craze. Actually, Divergent wasn't even out yet. It was the Hunger Games craze when I got my agent. And then after it sold, it was 2 years almost to the date from when the book sold to when the book came out. And that was, you know, a solid year, maybe a little more of editing and revising. And then it's like a year of, I'm not actively working on it, but the publisher is producing and printing and binding and distributing and all of that stuff. And that's pretty standard. I feel like most debuts, it's almost 2. Was yours 2 years, Julie, from purchase to your debut?
No, it was 1 year.
Wow,
it was just over 1 year. Yeah, I wrote the book this is Forest of a Thousand Lanterns I'm talking about. That's my debut. It's about the evil queen in fantasy Asia, and it was published by Penguin. I wrote it in the fall of 2015. In June 2016, we sold it. And then it came out October 2017. So it was just about a year and a half.
That's not the norm. Not in YA.
That's not the norm.
That's faster.
Yeah, that happened really fast.
I can't speak to like adult, but I feel like debuts usually, at least in YA, it's a year and a half is considered fast even. I feel like 2 is more the average.
Right.
Yeah.
So while we're approaching the end of our event here, Julie, you mentioned that you had some rapid fire questions that you wanted to ask, but
I did.
Before we do that, do you guys want to talk about any of your shiny new projects? Erin, you mentioned you revealed the cover of a certain new project. Would you like to talk about those?
Sure. I have my next YA novel is called Dustborn. It comes out April 20th, 2021. So we're less than a year away already, guys. And I haven't practiced pitching this one yet. So let me try to briefly tell you what it's about. It's basically like a mashup of all my novels. It's like part sci-fi, part Western, part dystopia. It's got like a Mad Max-esque feel. And it's about a girl called Delta of Dead River, who after her family is captured, she sort of sets out to rescue them and ends up discovering like a secret that's going to reshape her world that's sort of being ruled by this dictator rising to power. So that's out in April. And I also started, I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but during this COVID thing, I started writing a YA contemporary ghost story, like set at a summer camp in the Adirondacks. And I do have, maybe there will be a sequel. This works as a standalone, like you're not going to be left hanging when you finish it, but I have some ideas and like I'd love to write a sequel if I could. So that's what I'm doing. What are you doing, Julie?
Cool. I've got another book out this year, surprisingly. I just can't believe that it's coming out so soon because I haven't really been doing events. Let me grab it from my bookshelf. This is why it's so handy to do this event in my office because I have all of my books around. This is the advanced reader copy for Broken Wish, which is coming out from Disney. It's not the actual cover. You can view the actual cover on my website or Entertainment Weekly. But Broken Wish is the first book in a 4-book series from Disney, and it's about an original fairy tale. It's a family who has this curse that spreads down through the generations. So I'm writing the ancestors, and then there's going to be a different author for each of the subsequent books writing about a different branch of the family tree experiencing the same curse. So it's been really fun. It's been a dream come true writing for Disney because I was such a Disney kid growing up. So that's going to be my next thing out. And then hopefully I'll have some more things down the pipeline. I can't talk about them right now, but I'm just kind of trying everything. I'm trying to be like Erin Bowman. I'm trying to idolize her. I'm trying to write like different things like middle grade and maybe even making a foray into adult, writing more young adult. So we'll see what happens. It's kind of like throwing spaghetti at a wall, right, Erin?
Yeah, and then see if the idea sticks. And if it does, hey, nothing's off limits. That's my approach as well.
That's right.
So both of those books are already available for pre-order. I have put the links into our chat box. A last reminder before our rapid fire question round, these books are available for purchase from Gibson's Bookstore, and Erin will scribble her signature into any book of hers that you order. The order link for these books is again in the chat box. We will be sending out an email after this event that tomorrow that will have the purchase links if you need the links again. And then we are recording this event tonight. So if there is anybody who you think would have enjoyed this programming tonight, please do keep an eye on our social media and send them the link so that more people can discover The Girl in the Witch's Garden and Julie's books. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Julie, Erin, let's have some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
All right, here's some quick questions with quick answers. You ready? Would you rather spend the summer exploring a creepy house or a mysterious garden?
Mysterious garden.
Who would you rather encounter in a dark hallway? Piper's mean mom or the white Persian cat?
The cat. Although the cat would summon the mom, so maybe I just want to deal with the mom.
Okay, you go into your living room in the morning and you see a portal floating there. It's magical. What's on the other side of that portal?
Ooh, I don't know. I think I'd be too afraid to go into it. I think it would be like some sort of like time portal. Like it would take me to a different era. And that's why I'd be afraid to go through it.
That's a cool answer. So in the book, the kids have these objects that help amplify their magic. They're called amplifiers. What would be your magical amplifier?
I'm wearing it.
Oh,
this actually kind of, so this, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it. It says mama on it. It's a little bear.
Oh.
And so this actually kind of triggered the whole idea of everyday objects. I wear this when I'm away from my kids and it makes me feel closer to them, which feels like a sort of magic. And like that whole idea is what triggered everyone in the book using a very everyday object of sentimental value in many cases to serve as their amplifier.
Very nice. All right, I've got one last question, and you can feel free to plead the fifth because you're an author. This is a major conflict in the book. Are you a Red Sox fan or a Yankees fan?
Yeah, so growing up, I also grew up in Connecticut, and in Northwestern Connecticut, most people were Sox fans because we were northern and we were a little closer to Boston. But both of my parents are from New York, so I grew up a Yankees fan. I really don't follow baseball all that closely anymore. No, I know it's dangerous to say that up here, but I like quietly root for the Yankees still, but I'm not a crazy baseball fan anymore. But it was interesting to be a Yankees fan growing up in Connecticut because everyone is a Sox fan. So it's just a very quiet cheering.
You know, Erin, I don't know if you knew this, but Gibson's bookstore owner, Michael, is also a Yankees fan.
I did know that. We have bonded over that before because it's dangerous to be a Yankees fan up here in New Hampshire.
It is. But to be fair, he came from New York City. He came to New Hampshire from New York City. So we do allow him his eccentricities.
And that's the way it was. My parents were both from Long Island, and like you rooted either for the Mets or the Yankees. That's what you did. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for this wonderful event. Thank you, everybody, for joining us without shoes from your basements or your compasses tonight. We very much appreciate you attending. Keep an eye out for the recorded event so you can send it to all your friends. Again, the books are available. We do hope to see them. Erin will be coming back in to sign any books and orders that we get through the next few days. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Have a great night. Good night.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, guys.